I was 29 the afternoon my mother called to tell me she was thrilled for my brother. She used that exact word. Thrilled. She didn't ask how I was doing. She didn't ask about the drive I just made, 4 hours through rain on a bad back, to come home for my grandfather's estate meeting. She just said she was thrilled, and then she described, in the warm detail she only ever used for things that involved Nate, exactly what my grandfather had left him. The house, the land, the savings account, all of it. She said it like she was reading off a grocery list, like it was obvious, like the woman sitting in the parking lot of a lawyer's office in wet shoes had no reason to expect anything different. I didn't argue. I said, "That's wonderful, Mom," and I meant the opposite, and I hung up. Then I sat in that car for 11 minutes. I know it was 11 because I watched the clock the way I do when I need something to count instead of something to feel. Here's what my mother didn't know, and what my brother didn't know, and what I barely knew myself until a yellowed envelope arrived in my mailbox 6 weeks after my grandfather died. He had left me a letter. Not a bequest, not a formal codicil. A letter. Handwritten, 4 pages, in the careful, deliberate print of a man who had spent 50 years making things with his hands and knew the weight that ink could carry. And what was inside, that letter changed the shape of everything my family thought they had already settled. Welcome back to her silent triumph, where we tell the stories of quiet women, impossible families, and the moment the truth finally gets its voice. If you have ever been the one who got nothing while watching someone else get everything, this one is for you. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe, because the part where the letter opens is worth waiting for. Let me tell you who I was before any of this, because the family had a version of me that was never quite accurate. I'm a medical transcriptionist. I've worked from home for 7 years, building a client list that includes 3 hospital networks and a specialty clinic that pays on time and sends Christmas cards. I live alone in a rented apartment in a city 3 hours from the town where I grew up, and I like it that way. Not because I'm cold, but because I built something quiet and mine, and I guard it the way you guard anything you've had to put together yourself out of borrowed time and second shift pay. I was always the one in our family who was described as capable. My mother, Judith, used that word the way other mothers use the word kind. She said it without warmth. She said it the way you'd describe a dishwasher or a reliable car. Clara is capable. She'll be fine. Clara doesn't need as much. My brother Nathan, Nate, was 2 years younger and had needed more since the day he was born. Not because there was anything wrong with him. There wasn't. He was charming and quick, and had the kind of smile that made adults forget they'd been waiting for an answer. He needed attention. He needed encouragement. He needed a cosigner and a soft landing and a second chance and occasionally a third. My father, Robert, was a man who believed in equity in principle and practiced something closer to whichever of his children had called last. He meant well. He was simply not strong enough to mean it out loud when my mother was in the room, and my mother was always in the room. My grandfather, Thomas Voss, was something else entirely. He had built a house with his own hands in 1974 on a piece of land outside of Carver, Ohio, that had been in the family since his own father paid $30 an acre for it in cash during the Depression. The house was not big. 2 bedrooms, a porch that wrapped around 2 sides, a workshop attached to the back where he kept his tools in a row so orderly it looked like something from a museum. He'd worked as a machinist for 31 years and retired with his pension and his health, and no patience whatsoever for waste. He was not a soft man. He was not the grandfather who pulled quarters from behind your ear or bought you things without being asked. But when he decided to love you, it was the kind of love that required something back. It required your full attention. It required that you listen when he talked, not nodded along while checking your phone. It required that you show up on Sundays and actually sit with him on that porch, not spend 40 minutes on the driveway on a call, and then come in complaining about how long the drive was. Nate did all of those things. The phone in the driveway, the checking out, the complaining about the drive. I drove 4 hours every other Sunday for 9 years and sat on that porch until it was dark. Not for an inheritance. I want to be very clear about that, because what came later could look like strategy if you squint at it wrong. I sat on that porch because my grandfather was the one person in my family who ever talked to me like I was worth the full sentence. He asked what I was reading. He asked what I thought about things. He told me once, when I was 22 and sitting with him after my first real job fell through, that he had spent 30 years watching people be afraid of the wrong things. The small risks, he said, the ones that just sting when they go wrong, those aren't the ones that cost you your life. It's the big ones you never take because you talked yourself into calling them foolish. I carried that for years. He was 81 when he died. A Tuesday in November, quick, the way he'd always said he wanted. He was in his workshop sharpening a plain blade and his heart simply stopped. They said he probably didn't feel it. I believe that. He would have found anything else inefficient. The funeral was on a Friday. I drove 4 hours in the rain. Nate flew in from Portland, where he'd been living for the past 2 years on what our mother vaguely described as a creative venture, and what a mutual cousin more accurately described as his third attempt at something tech-adjacent that hadn't shipped yet. My mother cried beautifully. She always did. Nate gave a toast at the reception that mentioned Grandpa Thomas 4 times and himself 6. I counted because counting was the thing I did instead of reacting. I did not cry at the service. I cried on the drive home at a rest stop outside Dayton, parked under a single yellow light, and I cried the way you cry for someone who was actually good to you and is now irreversibly gone. The ugly kind. The kind with no performance in it. The kind that doesn't care what you look like because there's nobody watching. Then I drove the rest of the way home and went back to work Monday morning. The estate meeting was scheduled for 3 weeks after the funeral. I took a personal day, drove back to Carver, and arrived at the office of a man named Gerald Pritchard, Esquire, who had been my grandfather's attorney for 22 years. His office smelled like old coffee and printer paper, and the particular staleness of a room where people came to learn difficult things. My parents were already there when I arrived. My mother in a charcoal blazer, my father in the tie he wore to things he considered official. Nate came in behind me by 4 minutes, still pulling his jacket on, trailing an apology about parking. Gerald Pritchard was a deliberate man. He laid the documents on the table in order and explained each section the way a doctor explains a diagnosis, factually, waiting for you to catch up before moving to the next thing. My grandfather's estate, he said, consisted of the house and land on County Road 7. A savings account with a balance he did not name at that moment but said he would address, and a collection of workshop tools that my grandfather had specifically itemized and assigned. Gerald paused here. He looked at my parents. He looked at Nate. He looked at me. He said that my grandfather had updated his will 18 months before his death. The house and land were to pass to Nathan Voss. The savings account, the balance of which he now named, and it was not a small number, roughly $230,000 built over a lifetime of pension checks and skipped vacations, was to be distributed to the family at the trustee's discretion. My mother exhaled, the sound of someone who had known the answer before the question was asked. My brother looked at the table with the expression of a man working to appear appropriately solemn about good news. My father looked at me. Gerald looked at me too, and there was something in his face I couldn't read at the time, something careful, something that wasn't quite finished yet. He said that the will was not the complete picture of my grandfather's intentions, that there was one additional document that had been designated for my eyes only, per my grandfather's specific written instructions, that he would provide it to me privately after the meeting concluded. My mother asked what that meant. Gerald said it meant that my grandfather had left a private correspondence for Clara, and that its contents would be disclosed at my discretion. My mother asked again, different phrasing, same question. Gerald said, with the quietness of a man who had been at this a long time, that private meant private, Mrs. Voss. She sat back, her jaw moved twice without producing a word. The meeting ended 30 minutes later. Nate was already on his phone in the lobby before Gerald's secretary had finished gathering the signed acknowledgement forms. My mother made a point of touching my arm warmly on the way out and saying how wonderful it was that Grandpa had left something meaningful for all of us. in the particular tone she used when she was telling you a thing she needed to be true. I sat in Gerald Pritchard's office until everyone else was gone. He brought 2 cups of coffee without being asked. He set a yellowed envelope on the table between us. My name on the front in my grandfather's handwriting. Block letters. Careful. The same hand that labeled every drawer in that workshop. He said he'd step out, give me as long as I needed. I waited until the door clicked shut. Then I picked up the envelope and opened it. The letter was 4 pages, handwritten on the yellow legal pad paper my grandfather had used for everything. Shopping lists, measurements, the notes he took during the news at 9 o'clock. Each page was numbered in the top right corner in the way of a man who did not trust things to stay in order on their own. I'm going to tell you what it said. Not word for word, because the words were his and they belonged to him, but the substance of it, which was the most important thing anyone has ever said to me, and which I have read so many times the creases have gone soft. He started by saying that he knew I was probably sitting in Gerald's office right now, and that Gerald had probably already given me the good coffee, not the pot that sat all day. He said this without explanation, and it made me laugh out loud in an empty room, which I think he intended. He said he had not left me the house. He said he wanted to tell me directly that this was not an accident, not an oversight, not a sign of how he felt about me. He said he knew that I would understand that, and that the fact that I would understand it without needing to be convinced was one of the reasons he had made the choice he made. Then he told me why he left the house to Nate. He said Nate needed an anchor. He said he had watched my brother spend 20 years floating from one thing to the next, and that a man like that, without something fixed to him, would keep floating until there was nothing left to land on. He said the house was not a reward for Nate. It was a responsibility, the first real one he'd ever been given, and that he hoped it would hold him the way a good piece of joinery holds. Not by force, but by fit. He said he might be wrong about that. He said he'd been wrong before. He said I didn't need an anchor. He said I had been my own anchor since I was 19 years old, and he'd watched me do it and been quietly proud every single Sunday. I drove 4 hours to sit on his porch and ask him what he thought about things. Then he got to the part that changed everything. He said he had never trusted the savings account to be divided fairly by other people. He said he knew his daughter-in-law, my mother, and he said this without cruelty, just in the flat, declarative way of a man who has had 25 years to form an opinion. He said that money distributed at the family's discretion would find its way to the person it had always found its way to, and that this was not what he intended. He said that he had therefore made a different arrangement. He said the savings account was not entirely within the estate. He said that 3 years before his death, he had moved $170,000 of the $230,000 into a separate account held in my name as the sole beneficiary. Not a joint account, not a transfer-on-death arrangement that could be contested. An account he had opened in my name, with my social security number, which he had on file from the time he'd helped me do my taxes when I was 23 and didn't know what I was doing. He said the account was at a bank in Carver I'd never heard of. He said Gerald had the account number and the paperwork. He said the remaining $60,000 in the estate account was there intentionally, so the meeting I just sat through would look complete, so no one would come looking for the rest. He said he was sorry for the theater of it. He said he knew I would not enjoy sitting through that meeting. He said he was not sorry for the outcome. And then, on the last page, in writing that was a little smaller, a little more uneven, the way writing gets when a man is tired and saying the thing he actually means, he said this. He said he had watched me be quiet my whole life, because quiet was the only safe thing to be in our family. He said he had watched me drive 4 hours in rain and ice and never once arrive with anything less than my full self. He said he had watched my brother take 20 phone calls in the driveway of this house and never once come in without sighing first. He said he knew what the family would have done with what he left me if he had left it in the open. He said he had not built things for 50 years to watch them get reassigned to whoever made the most noise. He said, "You were always the one who showed up. This is me showing up for you. Better late than never, kid." He signed it with his full name, Thomas Arthur Voss, The way he signed important documents. The way he signed the deed to that house in 1974. I sat in Gerald Pritchard's office for a long time after I finished reading. Gerald came back in with a box of tissues he set on the table without comment, which was the most tactful thing anyone had done for me in years. He confirmed everything in the letter. The account existed. The balance was intact. The paperwork was in order. He had helped my grandfather set it up 3 years ago and had been instructed to say nothing to anyone until after the estate meeting concluded and the private letter had been delivered. He said my grandfather had been very clear about the order of operations. I asked if there was anything my family could contest. Gerald said the account was not part of the estate. It never had been. It was mine in the same way my lease was mine, in the same way my car was mine. It predated his death by 3 years. There was no argument to be made, no filing to dispute, no procedural door left open. He said my grandfather had been thorough. I said I knew. I drove home that evening without stopping. 4 hours. I didn't turn on the radio. I just let the road go past and held the letter in my mind the way you hold a thing that is both a gift and a grief, because it was both of those things, and I didn't need to rush the feeling. My mother called 2 days later. I want to tell you everything that was said, because it matters. She called in the early afternoon, which was her window for serious calls, after her coffee, before her shows. She asked how I was doing. She used the voice she used when she wanted something, the warm, slightly rounded version of herself that appeared at Christmas and around asks. I said I was fine. She said she and my father had been talking, and that they felt it was important, as a family, to make sure that the savings account was handled in a way that was fair to everyone. She said that Nate had some real opportunities right now, things that were about to come together, and that a little support could make a real difference at this particular moment. She said the discretionary language in the will gave them some flexibility there. I said I understood. She said she was glad I understood, because she knew it could feel unfair, the house going to Nate, but that she hoped I could see the bigger picture. I said I did see it. She asked if I would be reasonable about the distribution. And here is where I want to tell you something about what I have learned in 29 years of being Clara Voss about the moment when a door closes. It doesn't slam. It doesn't announce itself. It just clicks, softly, in the way of something that has been waiting a very long time to finally be shut. I said, Mom, Grandpa left me a letter. She was quiet. I said the letter explained some additional arrangements he'd made. I said those arrangements were already documented and filed, and that Gerald Pritchard had the paperwork. She asked what arrangements. I said I'd let Gerald explain the specifics if she had questions, because the account details were between me and the bank. And I didn't want to get anything wrong. She said she wasn't sure she understood. I said I know, Mom. There was a silence, long enough that I heard her breathing change, the way it does when she's recalculating something and hasn't landed on the answer yet. She said she was sure we could work something out. She said family took care of each other. She said Grandpa would have wanted us all to feel provided for. I thought about 4 pages of yellow legal pad paper. I thought about block letters and creased edges and 170,000 reasons why she was wrong about what Grandpa would have wanted. I said I was sure he would have. Then I said I had to get back to work, and I was very kind about it, and I hung up. She called Gerald Pritchard the next morning. I know because Gerald called me. He said my mother had contacted him asking for information about additional estate assets. He said he had confirmed that the account in question was not an estate asset and therefore not subject to estate proceedings. He said he had recommended she speak with her own attorney if she had further questions. He said, and I could hear something like careful satisfaction in his voice, that my grandfather had in fact anticipated this phone call. That there was a note in the file, signed and dated 3 years ago, documenting that Thomas Arthur Voss had discussed this arrangement with his attorney in full possession of his faculties and with complete understanding of its implications. The note was there specifically to address any future claim of undue influence, diminished capacity, or improper transfer. Gerald said my grandfather had used the phrase, "let them try." I thanked him. He said the pleasure was his. He said he had known Thomas Voss for 22 years, and that helping him build this had been one of the more satisfying things he'd done in the back half of his career. My mother did not speak to me for 6 weeks. During those 6 weeks, the following things happened. Nate called me once, not about the money, or not directly. He called to tell me that the house needed a new water heater and that he was looking into what that cost and whether the estate could cover it. I told him the estate was closed. He was quiet for a moment and then said something about how it was a lot of responsibility, the house, more than he'd expected. I said I knew. I said Grandpa had known too. There was a pause that I let sit. I did not offer to help with the water heater. Not because I'm cruel, because my grandfather had read Nate correctly. The house was supposed to be the hard thing that made him stay put and figure something out. Solving it for him on week 4 would have undone the whole point. My father called on a Thursday evening. Not my mother, my father, which was unusual enough that I answered on the second ring. He said he wanted to say something without your mother knowing I called, and I said okay. He said he thought what Grandpa had done was fair. He said this quickly, like a man getting a thing out before he lost his nerve. He said he'd always known, in the back of his mind, that things weren't quite even in the family. He said he'd told himself it balanced out in ways he couldn't see. He said he thought maybe he'd been wrong about that. I asked him what he meant. He said he meant all of it. The Sundays, the 4 hours, the fact that I'd been described as capable my whole life and what that had actually required of me, what it had asked me to absorb without complaint. He said he was sorry. It was a small apology. Quiet, imprecise, a little late. The kind that doesn't rewrite the past but does crack a window open in the present. I told him I appreciated it. I meant it. My father was not a bad man. He was a man who had spent 30 years choosing the easier road at every fork in the marriage, and the easier road had led somewhere that cost his daughter something real. Understanding that is not the same as excusing it, but I was done being angry at the ghost of a choice my father made 1,000 Tuesdays ago. Anger takes up space I needed for other things. He asked if we were okay. I said we were getting there. He said that was more than he'd expected, and he sounded like he meant it. 6 weeks after my grandfather's estate meeting, I did 3 things. The first was that I called the bank in Carver and arranged to have the funds transferred to an account in my own city. It was not dramatic. It was a phone call and some paperwork and a hold time of 11 minutes. The woman who helped me had a cheerful voice and walked me through each step without asking why I was moving money or where it was going. She just helped me do the thing. That was all I needed. The second thing I did was take a personal day and drive back out to the house on County Road 7. Nate had moved in by then. There were 2 bikes on the porch, a pair of muddy boots by the door, a stack of mail on the railing that hadn't been sorted. The workshop was locked. I had expected that. I stood at the window and looked in at the tools in their rows, all of them still exactly where my grandfather had left them. He had given the tools to me. I hadn't known that when Gerald read the will, because Gerald had said he'd address the tools separately. And then the rest of the meeting had happened, and I'd sat in his office reading a letter, and the tools had slipped my mind. But it was in the will. The workshop and all its contents my grandfather had written to my granddaughter Clara, who will know what to do with them. Nate let me in without argument. He looked tired, the way people look when a responsibility that seemed exciting has become real. He made coffee. We sat in my grandfather's kitchen at my grandfather's table and drank it. He asked if I was angry. I thought about it honestly. I said I had been. I said I wasn't anymore mostly, and that the mostly was real, but so was the not anymore. He nodded. Then he said something I hadn't expected him to say. He said Grandpa was right to leave me something separate. He said he didn't know what that something was, but he knew it existed. He could tell from the meeting, from the way Gerald looked at me, from the way our mother's voice had sounded on the phone the morning after. He said he hoped it was enough. I said it was. He looked out the window at the porch, at the 2 bikes, at the muddy boots. He said it was a lot, the house. He said he'd been thinking about what to do with it and hadn't landed anywhere yet. I said that was okay. I said that was the point, in a way. He asked what I meant. I said Grandpa didn't give you the house because you'd figured things out. He gave it to you so you'd have to. Nate was quiet for a while. Then he said that sounded like something Grandpa would say. I said it was, almost word for word. The third thing I did was take the workshop tools, not immediately, not all at once, but over 3 trips that fall. I brought my car and Nate helped me load them, carefully, because we had both been raised by a man who cared how you handled things. I set them up in a storage unit in my city because my apartment didn't have room yet for all of them, but I knew what I wanted to do with them. There is a community makerspace in my city that runs programs for teenagers, mostly kids in foster care and transitional housing, who are learning to build things. They needed a tool donation. They needed it badly. A man there named Jerome had been scraping together second-hand tools for 2 years, and the collection was, his word, heartbreaking. I brought him my grandfather's tools on a Saturday morning in November, 1 year almost to the day after Thomas Arthur Voss died in his workshop on County Road 7. Jerome shook my hand for a long time. He asked where they came from. I said from a man who believed that the way you treat tools tells you something about the way you treat everything else. Jerome said that was right. I said my grandfather would have liked hearing that. I didn't say anything else. Jerome didn't ask for more. We unloaded the car together in an easy silence, the kind that exists between people who don't need to fill every space with words. My mother called me in December, 3 months after the estate meeting, 6 weeks after the silence ended. She called on a Sunday morning, which was not her window. Sunday morning was her church window, which told me she'd been sitting with this long enough that she couldn't wait for the right time anymore. She said she wanted to talk. I said okay. She said she had been thinking about the situation. She used that word, situation, a clean word, a word without assignment of fault. She said she wanted me to know that she wasn't angry. I said I wasn't either. She said she felt your grandfather could have been more transparent. I said that was an interesting word for it. She said there had been some confusion, and that she'd spoken with a lawyer of her own, and that she understood now that the account predated everything. I said I knew it did. She asked if there was any chance, any flexibility at all, in terms of how I planned to use what he'd left me. And I want to tell you something. This was the moment I had been thinking about since I sat in Gerald Pritchard's office. The moment when the door would be half open, and I would have to decide what kind of person I was going to be standing in front of it. I thought about what I was not going to do. I was not going to hand her a number. I was not going to allow the inheritance my grandfather built over a lifetime of pension checks and unspent vacations to flow toward my brother's next creative venture or my mother's renovation, or any other use that served the family's convenience rather than my grandfather's intention. I was also not going to be unkind about it. I said, Mom, Grandpa thought about this for a long time. He wrote me a letter. He explained his reasons. They were good reasons, and I think if you could have read them, you would have recognized them, even if they were hard to hear. She was quiet. I said I'm going to use what he left me the way he meant for me to use it. I'm going to take care of myself the way I've always taken care of myself, except now I'll have a little room to breathe that I didn't have before. And that's what he wanted for me. She said she just wanted things to be fair. I said I know you do. I didn't say what I was thinking, which was that fairness and equality are not the same thing, and that my grandfather had understood the difference precisely. Fairness is what you owe people when you add up the full picture. Equality is what you give when you aren't looking at the picture at all. My grandfather had looked at the full picture for 9 years of Sunday visits and 4-hour drives, and a granddaughter who showed up without being asked and stayed until it was dark. He had been looking at it longer than I knew. I said I loved her, and I meant it in the way you can mean something and also hold steady at the same time. I said I hoped the new year would be a good one for all of us. Then I let her go. I want to tell you where things are now, because I think endings deserve to be honest. My brother is still in the house on County Road 7. He replaced the water heater himself, which took him 3 weeks and 2 failed attempts and a YouTube tutorial series, and he told me about it with more genuine pride than I had ever heard in his voice about any of the ventures in Portland. He's been there almost a year. He got a part-time position doing IT support for a school district nearby. He mows the lawn. He fixed a fence post in the fall that was leaning the same way my grandfather's fence posts never leaned, because Grandpa checked them twice a year, and Nate is learning now why that matters. I don't know if the house will hold him the way my grandfather hoped. I don't know if it will become the thing that makes him stay put and figure something out. Maybe. Nate has surprised me before. He surprised me when he helped me load those tools without being asked, and when he told me Grandpa was right to leave me something separate. Those were not the responses of a man who only ever thought about himself. They were the responses of a man who was, slowly, becoming someone slightly different. I'm cautious about it, but I'm not closed to it. My father calls every few weeks. We talk about ordinary things. The weather, my work, a book he's reading. We don't talk about the estate. We don't need to. The conversation we had on that Thursday evening was the real one, and it doesn't need to be repeated or annotated. It just sits there between us, true, a small cleared space where something better might eventually grow. My mother and I are polite. We are careful with each other in the way of people who know exactly where the soft spots are and have agreed without saying so not to press them. It's not warmth. I'm not going to tell you it's warmth. It's the honest version of the thing, which is two people deciding that the relationship is worth continuing in the form that's actually available, rather than destroying it by demanding the form that isn't. As for me, I still live in my apartment. I still work. I still get up early and make coffee and sit at my desk in the quiet before the day starts. The difference is that there's a funded account now with my name on it, and a balance that means when something breaks, I don't have to spend a week calculating the math. When my car needed a repair in January, I paid for it the same day. I stood at the counter and handed over my card, and there was no math, no deferral, no mental gymnastics, and I felt what I can only describe as the particular quiet of a problem that is not actually a problem anymore. My grandfather called it room to breathe. He was right, that's what it is, a little room. And on my desk, in a plain frame I bought at a drugstore for $7, is the last page of his letter. The handwriting small and a little uneven. The words that I read in Gerald Pritchard's office and have read every day since. You were always the one who showed up. This is me showing up for you. Better late than never, kid. I have thought a great deal about what it means that he spent years building this quietly, without telling me, without even hinting at it on all those Sunday evenings, when we sat on his porch watching the light go, and he could have said something and chose instead to just let me be there. I have thought about what it required of him to sit across from my parents at holidays and at dinners and never show his hand. I have thought about Gerald Pritchard helping him draft documents and open accounts and write careful notes anticipating every challenge, every phone call, every someone's attorney asking the wrong questions. He was not a soft man, but he was a thorough one. And in the end, thoroughness was the more loving thing. I have learned, sitting with this for nearly a year now, that the people who love you best don't always announce it at the moment they feel it. Sometimes they announce it in the form of a Sunday afternoon, in the form of a question asked and actually listened to, in the form of 4 pages of yellow legal pad paper left in an envelope with your name on the front in block letters, sitting in a lawyer's office, waiting for the meeting to end. Sometimes, love looks like a door you don't know is open until you need it to be. My grandfather saw what was coming long before I did. He saw the phone calls in the driveway, and the sighing on the way in, and the mother who had already divided the money in her head before his body was cold. He saw all of it, and he said nothing, and he built something instead. He couldn't stop my mother from being who she is. He couldn't make the family fair by announcing fairness in a room. He couldn't give me back the years of being described as capable like it was a consolation prize. But he could make sure that, when the time came, I was standing on ground that was mine. He just let me think he was being poetic. He wasn't. That's my story. 1 letter, 1 lifetime of Sunday afternoons, and a man who understood that the most important things you build are the ones nobody sees until they're needed. If someone in your life shows up without being asked, in rain, in traffic, in the ordinary, unremarkable way of people who just keep coming back, go tell them what that means before you have to write it down. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.